Sometimes you just have to pretend you haven't spent any money or time on a project and just start from scratch. Hi, I'm Nika Waters, and welcome to the Boat Galley Podcast. Today I'm talking about the importance of ignoring sunk costs, because sometimes it's better just to start all over again. Today's episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by Pantry in Paradise. As cruisers, we've all experienced LOB, or lost on board. You know you have something like a can of mushroom soup, but you just can't find it. Enter Pantry in Paradise, your go-to app for galley management. Pantry in Paradise tracks your provisions, where they're stored, and even creates your next shopping list. Provision for guests and extra weeks. Find Pantry in Paradise in the App Store and on Google Play. So my most recent example of ignoring sunk costs has to do with some work that we were doing on our house in northern Vermont. My parents had spent hours, and we had spent hours, scraping an old wall that probably just needed to be replaced. It was an external wall, siding on the outside, and we're trying really hard to just eke 1 or 2 more seasons out of it. At one point, my mom said, do you think we should just forget this and replace the whole thing? And we took a look at it and decided, no, let's keep scraping. So I went back on one Friday afternoon to look at the stuff that had been totally scraped and was ready for paint. And I looked at the stuff that actually had been repainted already. And looking at it, it looked like it hadn't even been touched. And I knew how much time had been spent on it. So I went and said, Jeremy, hey, will you look at this again? The wood is really pretty rotten. We can spend some more time prepping and painting with expensive paint. It's stain, actually, but expensive stain. Or we can just bite the bullet and replace the siding now. We had hours into that scraping. We probably had another 10 or 20 more hours to go just on that wall. And it's really hard to ignore those sunk costs. What's really hard is to ignore those and to use them as a roadmap. It's really easy to understand that. I've already put this much time into it. I've got just a little bit more time and I'll finish it off and then I'll be good to go. You spend all this time and money on something that you thought was a really good idea, and changing direction somehow feels like an admission of failure. Like all the work that you've done is wasted. But if I can provide a different perspective, that continuing to pour resources into that good idea, more time, just because you've already spent time or money that feels like it's already been spent, why should you really throw more resources into it? With this wall, what we realized is we were going to have to replace that siding in the next year or 2 anyway, even if we spent more hours and more of that paint resource on it. And we said, I think we just need to pretend we never did all that work in the first place and just rip it off and start from scratch. And so we did. And I will tell you that every time we look at that wall now, knowing that we don't have to do anything to it next year. We don't have to replace certain boards. We don't have to look at it and regret all the time that was put into it. Because next year, once the cedar has weathered for a year, it's not going to take that long to put on that stain that we didn't have to put on this year. This happens with boat projects all the time. You start yourself down a road of work that you think is the best thing going. And partway through, you take a look and you sit back and you sort of say, no, that wasn't the right call. And it's really easy to think, I've already put this time and money into it, I should keep going. I'm here to perhaps ask you to rethink that thinking. And instead of looking at that already spent time and money as a roadmap. Look at it maybe as a learning experience. And look and say, give yourself permission to say, nope, need to shift gears. Maybe you need to sit on that decision for a couple of days just to make sure. But don't be afraid to change your mind if you think you're not going to be happy with the end result. Gauging whether or not to continue a project after you've identified a major flaw in the idea or even in the execution, just because you've already got a lot of hours into it, isn't necessarily the way to think about it. Look forwards, not backwards. And whatever your boat project is that you're thinking about, may you get to the point that you can look at that beautiful finished thing and just be really happy that you started from scratch again. Thanks so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast. We love it when we hear from our listeners. We love it when you share us with your friends. We love it when you leave us 5-star reviews. And we love it when you subscribe. Have a spectacular week.